Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back into the deepest, darkest corners of the past. Places where the harvest is in, the nights are growing long, and the wind whistling through the thatched roof sounds a little too much like a ghostly whisper. That's right, we're talking about a time when Halloween wasn't about candy and costumes, but about a genuine, bone-deep fear that on one night of the year, the dead didn't stay dead. This isn't your local haunted house attraction. This is the real, murky, and profoundly superstitious world of medieval Europe, where the line between the living and the dead was thought to be terrifyingly thin. So before you settle in with your pumpkin spice latte and your favorite horror movie, hit like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And if you have any theories on the best way to ward off evil spirits, let me know in the comments. Now, dim those lights, put a fan on for that nostalgic white noise, or just for the comfort of imagining you're not about to hear a spectral huntsman galloping past your window. Get cozy. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what Halloween was like before it was Halloween? Was it just another evening? Or did the setting sun on October 31st bring a special kind of dread? Did people really believe ghosts could walk the earth, seeking vengeance or hospitality? Why were bonfires so important, and what did they have to do with bones? How many prayers would it take to protect your home from whatever lurked in the darkness? Could you survive a medieval Halloween armed with nothing but a hollowed-out turnip and a pocket full of salt? And just how much did the fear of purgatory shape the way people viewed the spirits of their own departed family? Was the local priest your best defense? Could you tell a friendly ancestral ghost from a malevolent demon? And is it true that trick-or-treating started with the poor begging for cakes in exchange for prayers for the dead? Congratulations. You've just woken up in a medieval village. It's October 31st. You're wearing scratchy wool. You don't remember the last time you were truly warm. And the sun is beginning to set on the most dangerous night of the year. It's probably time to light a candle. Good luck. The house is silent, the sky barely orange, and your eyes are drawn to the setting sun. For the medieval peasant, the sun is not just a celestial body, it is the source of all warmth, all life, all safety. And as it sinks below the horizon on the last day of October, it feels like it's taking all of that with it. The air grows cold, not just with the coming of November, but with a deeper, more ancient chill. Welcome to the edge of winter, the borderland of the year, a time the ancient Celts called Samhain. To understand the profound fear that gripped the medieval mind on this night, you first have to understand their world. This is a life lived in rhythm with the seasons. Summer is the time of light and life, of hard work in the fields that promise survival. Autumn is the time of harvest, a frantic, final burst of activity to gather every last grain, every last apple before the world dies. And winter is the dark half of the year. It is the time of hunger, of cold, of sickness, and of death. Samhain, the ancient Gaelic festival celebrated on October 31st, marked this terrifying transition. It was the new year, in a way, but not a happy one. It was the moment the gates of winter swung open and the world of light and warmth was locked away. Long before the church bells tolled for All Hallows' Eve, the Celtic people of Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man believed that Samhain was a liminal time, a time when the boundaries between this world and the other world grew thin, porous, and unstable. Imagine living in a small, wattle and daub hut, the darkness outside almost absolute, broken only by the flickering light of your hearth fire. There are no street lights, no friendly glow from a neighbor's window down the road. There is only the vast, rustling, and profoundly unknown dark of the natural world. Now imagine being told that on this one night, that darkness is filled with spirits. The souls of those who had died were believed to return to their homes, while other, less friendly entities could also cross over. This belief was not a metaphor. It was as real to them as the cold floor beneath their feet. The spirits of ancestors were expected and even welcomed. Places might be set for them at the table, and offerings of food and drink left out to appease them and ensure their goodwill for the coming year. But with the friendly dead came the others, harmful spirits, vengeful ghosts, and the powerful feared beings known as the AOC, the fairies or spirits of the ancient burial mounds. These were not the charming, winged creatures of later folklore. The AOC were seen as potent, dangerous beings, easily offended and capable of causing great harm to humans, their livestock, and their crops. To survive the night, people developed rituals of protection. Great communal bonfires were lit on hilltops. The flames served a practical purpose, of course, providing light and a gathering point, but their real power was symbolic and magical. The fires were believed to have cleansing and protective qualities, mimicking the sun to hold back the darkness and decay of winter. People would carry torches lit from the bonfire back to their homes to relight their own hearths, bringing the protective magic of the communal flame into their private space. The smoke and ash were thought to ward off evil. In some traditions, these were literally bone fires, as the bones of slaughtered livestock were thrown into the flames, a grim offering to the unseen world. This was the world that Christianity encountered as it spread throughout Europe, a world where the end of October was already deeply associated with the dead, the supernatural, and a profound sense of dread. The Church, in its wisdom, didn't try to erase these deep-seated beliefs. Instead, it did what it always did. It absorbed them, rebranded them, and layered a new Christian meaning over the ancient pagan fears. But deep down, in the flickering shadows of the medieval cottage, the old fears remained. The knowledge that winter was coming, and on this night, the barrier to the world of the dead was open. As the last light fades and the village is plunged into darkness, the real fear begins to settle in. It's one thing to understand that winter is coming. It's another thing entirely to believe that the spirits of the dead are now walking among you. For the medieval person, the thinning of the veil between worlds on All Hallows' Eve was not a quaint piece of folklore. It was a terrifying reality, a spiritual crisis that had to be managed with careful ritual and profound respect. The night was alive, and not everything that moved in the shadows was friendly. The spirits they feared came in many forms. First, there were the ghosts of the recently departed, especially those who had died during the past year. It was believed their souls were journeying to the other world, and on this night they could return to their former homes, seeking warmth and hospitality. You were expected to welcome them. A place might be set by the fire, a candle lit in the window to guide them, and food left out. To fail in this duty was to risk offending the spirit of your own grandmother or brother, who might then linger and cause trouble. But not all ghosts were benign ancestors looking for a comfortable chair. The medieval world was full of stories of restless and malevolent spirits. These were the souls of those who had died with unfinished business, who had been wronged in life and now sought vengeance. Or they were the spirits of sinners, unable to find peace and doomed to wander the earth.
These weren't transparent, ethereal beings. Medieval ghosts were often described as terrifyingly solid, capable of physical interaction and driven by powerful, raw emotions. Encountering one was not an interesting paranormal experience. It was a potentially fatal one. Preachers and theologians had a complicated relationship with ghosts. Some argued they were merely demons in disguise, sent to trick the faithful. Others, however, used ghost stories in their sermons, portraying them as souls begging for prayers to release them from the pains of purgatory, a concept we will explore later. Beyond human spirits, there was the fear of something older and far more alien, the fairies or the Eos Sea. The medieval conception of these beings was a far cry from the delicate sprites of Victorian fancy. They were powerful, amoral, and fiercely territorial, seen as the descendants of ancient gods or fallen angels. Their world existed parallel to the human one, hidden inside hills and ancient burial mounds, which were seen as portals to the other world. On Samhain, when the portals were open, the Eos Sea could emerge to ride across the countryside. They were known to steal livestock, blight crops, and most terrifyingly, abduct humans. A person who wandered too far from the village bonfire might be taken into a fairy hill, never to return, or to return years later without having aged a day, to find their world utterly changed. Children were thought to be especially vulnerable, with fears of them being replaced by a sickly, fairy changeling. People would invoke the protection of God when passing by known fairy dwellings, and leave offerings of milk or grain to appease these powerful neighbors. This is where one of the most iconic traditions of Halloween has its roots: the wearing of costumes. The practice of guising or mumming was a form of spiritual defense. By dressing in frightening costumes, often made of animal skins or straw, people hoped to achieve one of two things. Either they would fool the malevolent spirits into thinking they were one of them, and thus be left alone, or their grotesque appearance would actively scare away the ghouls and ghosts. It was a desperate kind of camouflage. You didn't dress up as a monster for fun. You dressed up as a monster to survive the night. It was a way of hiding in plain sight, of making yourself invisible to the supernatural terrors that you believed were genuinely walking down the same muddy track as you. And so you huddle in your hut, the wind rattling the door, listening to the sounds of the night, and you pray that the disguise you fashioned from a goat's hide and a hollowed-out turnip is convincing enough.
While the ancient fears of Samhain pulsed in the heart of the common folk, the medieval church was hard at work building a powerful theological framework to contain and control this supernatural dread. The story of why medieval people feared Halloween is incomplete without understanding the Church's masterful act of religious rebranding. The creation of the three-day observance of All Hallowtide, All Hallows Eve, October 31st, All Saints' Day, November 1st, and All Souls' Day, November 2nd, was an attempt to redirect the powerful spiritual energy of the season toward a Christian understanding of life, death, and salvation. The process began in the 8th century when Pope Gregory III moved the Feast of All Saints' Day from May to November 1st. Originally a day to commemorate Christian martyrs, it was expanded to honor all the saints in heaven, known and unknown.
Scholars suggest this move was a deliberate strategy to co-opt the existing pagan festival of Samhain, providing a Christian alternative to the deeply ingrained traditions. All Saints' Day was a major holy day. The evening before it, All Hallows' Eve, was therefore a vigil, a time of prayer, fasting, and spiritual watchfulness in preparation for the great feast. Imagine the scene. As darkness falls on October 31st, the church bells begin to toll. This sound, which might seem mournful to us, was a sound of power and protection to the medieval mind. It was believed that the ringing of consecrated bells could drive away evil spirits, creating a sonic barrier of holiness around the village. Inside the church, services would be held, the space lit with the warm, sweet-smelling glow of beeswax candles and filled with the scent of incense. For a people living in a world of darkness and fear, the church on this night was a fortress of light, a literal piece of heaven on earth meant to stand against the forces of hell. The priests, dressed in brilliant white or gold vestments reserved for the most important holy days, would lead the congregation in prayers. Their sung Latin liturgy, a powerful incantation against the chaos of the supernatural world. But the Church's masterstroke came in the 10th century with the establishment of All Souls' Day on November 2nd. Instituted by the influential Benedictine Abbey of Cluny in France, this day was set aside specifically to pray for the souls of the faithful departed who were not yet in heaven, the souls trapped in purgatory. This innovation tapped directly into the pre-existing belief that the dead returned at this time of year, but gave it a distinctly Christian focus. Now, the ghosts people feared were not just random, vengeful spirits. They were the souls of their own relatives, suffering in the cleansing fires of purgatory and in desperate need of help from the living. This created what historians call a spiritual economy. The living and the dead were bound in a system of mutual obligation. The souls in purgatory could not help themselves, but the living could help them by offering prayers, giving alms to the poor, and having masses said on their behalf. These actions, it was believed, could literally reduce the amount of time a loved one had to spend in torment. In turn, the souls, once they reached heaven, could intercede for the living. This belief gave people a sense of agency against the terror of death and the afterlife, but it also created profound anxiety. A popular belief developed that on this night, souls from purgatory could appear on earth to haunt those who had wronged them or forgotten them. That ghostly figure you saw at the edge of the woods might not be a demon, but your own great-uncle begging you to pray for his release. The fear was no longer just of a malevolent other, but of failing in your sacred duty to your own family. And so, the eve of All Hallows became a night not just of superstitious terror, but of deep, solemn, and fearful obligation.
As the church bells rang out their holy challenge to the spirits of the night, the individual villager was engaged in a more personal, intimate battle. The safety of the community was one thing, but the sanctity of one's own home and family was another. On All Hallows' Eve, every cottage, no matter how humble, became a fortress that had to be spiritually fortified against the supernatural invasion. This was a night for talismans, rituals, and wards, a time when folk magic and Christian faith blended seamlessly in a desperate attempt to make it through to sunrise.
Fire and light were the primary weapons in this spiritual warfare. The communal bonfire was the first line of defense, but its protective power had to be brought into the home. After the main hearth fire was extinguished, a torch lit from the sacred bonfire would be carried back to relight it, creating a symbolic connection to the community's collective strength and purity. But the most iconic use of light was the ancestor of our modern jack-o'-lantern. Long before pumpkins were available in Europe, people in Ireland and Britain carved grotesque faces into turnips, beets, or large potatoes. A lit candle or a burning piece of coal was placed inside, creating a ghoulish lantern. These were not merely decorations, they served a dual purpose. Their frightening faces were meant to scare off evil spirits, and the light itself was a beacon of protection. Some folklore suggests they were also meant to represent the souls of the dead, either as a tribute or as a warning. Imagine the eerie sight of these lumpy, glowing faces flickering in the windows of every hut, a silent, grimacing army standing guard against the unseen. Salt was another powerful protective agent. Its use as a preservative gave it a reputation as a purifying substance, capable of repelling corruption, both physical and spiritual. On this night, a villager might sprinkle a line of salt across the thresholds of their home, the doorways and windowsills, creating a magical barrier that malevolent spirits and witches could not cross. Some people even carried small pouches of salt with them if they had to venture outside, a personal, portable shield against the forces of darkness. Holy water, blessed by the village priest, served a similar purpose, and was often sprinkled around the home and barn to protect the family and their precious livestock. The fear of witches was particularly potent at this time of year. By the late medieval ages, it was widely believed that witches gathered on All Hallows' Eve to perform dark rituals, cast spells, and consort with the devil. They were thought to have the power to curdle milk, lame horses, and bring sickness upon their enemies. The traditional image of the black cat as a symbol of bad luck dates back to this period, as they were often believed to be a witch's familiar, a supernatural assistant in the form of an animal. To protect against this threat, people turned to both faith and folklore. Religious icons and crosses were hung prominently in the home, but they also employed folk charms. In Scotland, the branches of the juniper or rowan tree were considered powerful wards against witchcraft and were often placed over doorways. Noise was also a weapon. Just as the church bells drove spirits away on a grand scale, families could create their own protective cacophony. Banging pots and pans or ringing small handbells was a common practice, the jarring noise believed to disorient and frighten away any lurking ghosts or ghouls. It was a way of fighting back, of making the darkness a little less quiet, and therefore a little less menacing. All of these rituals, the lanterns, the salt, the charms, the noise, were born of a deep-seated anxiety. This was not a game. The medieval person believed their home was under siege from a very real and present danger. Every shadow in the corner, every gust of wind against the wattle walls could be a spirit trying to get in. Fortifying the home was an act of desperate hope, a prayer made of ritual and superstition, all aimed at one simple goal: to keep the living on one side of the threshold and the dead on the other. In the midst of all this fear and solemnity, a strange and theatrical tradition took hold in the villages of medieval Britain and Ireland. As spirits, both good and evil, were thought to roam the night, some people chose to join them, or at least to pretend to. The practices of guising and souling were complex rituals that blended fear, faith, and social obligation, and they contain the earliest seeds of what we now know as trick or treating. But for the medieval participant, this was far more than a quest for candy. It was a transaction for the fate of a human soul. The tradition of souling is first recorded around the 15th century and was deeply connected to the new Christian focus on All Souls' Day and the doctrine of purgatory. On the days of All Hallowtide, the poor, along with children, would go from door to door, offering to say prayers for the souls of the household's dead relatives. In exchange for these vital prayers, which were believed to help ease a soul's journey out of purgatory, they would be given soul cakes. These were typically small, round, spiced cakes, often marked with a cross to show they were given as alms. Shakespeare even mentions the practice in his play The Two Gentlemen of Verona, showing how ingrained it had become. This was not simply begging, it was a crucial part of the spiritual economy. The wealthy fulfilled their Christian duty of charity, while the poor provided a spiritual service that the rich desperately needed. The soulers, as they were called, were acted as representatives for the dead, their prayers a currency that could purchase relief for suffering spirits. Sometimes the soulers would carry hollowed-out turnip lanterns with them, the light inside said to represent a soul trapped in purgatory, a haunting visual reminder of what was at stake. Imagine the solemn procession, small groups of shivering children and impoverished adults moving through the cold night, their voices raised in song and prayer, collecting these small cakes that were both sustenance for the living and salvation for the dead. Running parallel to this was the older, more chaotic tradition of guising or mumming, which had its roots in the pagan desire to hide from evil spirits. As we've seen, people would don costumes to impersonate the spirits and other worldly beings they believed were active on this night. This was a form of protective mimicry. Over time, however, this practice evolved. Instead of just hiding, the guisers began to perform. Young people would go from house to house in costume, and in exchange for food, drink, or money, they would offer a performance, reciting verses, singing songs, telling jokes, or playing a short scene. This was a more boisterous and carnivalesque affair than the solemn ritual of souling, though the two traditions often blended together. The guisers were not just begging, they were providing entertainment, a moment of levity and community performance on a night otherwise filled with dread. Their costumes, often homemade and grotesque, were meant to represent the spirits of winter who demanded a reward in exchange for good fortune in the coming year. It was a way of engaging with the supernatural world on your own terms, of turning fear into a form of festive theater. So, when you see a child on your doorstep shouting trick or treat,
You are witnessing the faint, distant echo of these two medieval traditions. One was a solemn prayer for the dead, born of a deep fear of purgatory and a desperate hope for salvation. The other was a wild, costumed performance, born of an even older fear of the spirits that walked in the dark night. In both cases, the transaction was key. An offering was given in exchange for something intangible. A prayer, a song, a moment of protection from the things that went bump in the medieval night.
Of all the terrors that stalked the medieval imagination on a stormy autumn night, few were as visceral and horrifying as the legend of the Wild Hunt. This was not a single stationary ghost or a localized fairy mound. The Wild Hunt was a spectral army on the move, a phantasmal cavalcade of ghostly riders and howling hounds that would sweep across the land and sky, a terrifying omen of war, plague, or the death of whoever was unlucky enough to witness it. On a night like All Hallows' Eve, when the boundary to the other world was already open, the possibility of the hunt riding felt terrifyingly close. The myth was prevalent across northern and central Europe, with local variations, but the core elements remained the same. In the Germanic lands, it was known as the Wild Jagd, or Wutendes Heer, furious army. In Scandinavia, it was the Oscarea, or terrifying ride. The leader of the hunt varied. Sometimes it was a damned soul, a historical figure like Charlemagne, or a local nobleman condemned to hunt for eternity as punishment for his wickedness. But often the leader was a figure from the pagan past, most notably the Norse god Odin or his Germanic equivalent Woden, now demoted by Christianity to a demonic spectre. In some versions, the leader was a female goddess, a grim, ghostly queen. Imagine you are a traveler, hurrying home as a storm brews on the horizon. The wind begins to howl through the trees, a sound that slowly resolves into the baying of hounds and a distant blast of a hunting horn. The air grows preternaturally still. Then the sound of 1,000 galloping hooves thunder through the forest, and the hunt appears. Riders on skeletal black horses, their cloaks streaming behind them, their eyes glowing like embers. They are accompanied by a pack of monstrous black dogs, and sometimes carry the souls of the recently deceased with them. To see them was to see your own death foretold. The Wild Hunt was deeply connected to the roughest, darkest time of the year, midwinter, when storms were most ferocious. The howling of the wind was often interpreted as the sound of the hunt passing by. People believed the hunt could snatch the souls of the living, pulling sleeping spirits from their bodies to join the ghastly procession, or kidnapping anyone caught outdoors in its path. The first written accounts of these ghostly processions date back to the 11th and 12th centuries. One chronicler, Orderic Vitalis, recorded the story of a priest who, in 1092, witnessed a vast horde of ghostly figures, including women being tortured, who told him they were the souls of the dead suffering for their sins. How did one protect oneself from such a terrifying apparition? If you heard the hunt approaching, the advice was simple and desperate. You did not look. You were to throw yourself face down on the ground, hiding your face in the dirt, and pray the riders would pass you by unnoticed. Reciting the Lord's Prayer was thought to offer some protection. Iron, a substance believed to repel spirits, was also used. Drawing a circle around yourself with an iron knife could potentially save you. But the best defense was to be indoors, with the doors barred and the shutters drawn tight, hoping the storm of souls would pass over your house without stopping. If the hunt was heard to pause over a particular house, it was believed that death would visit that family within the year. This legend represents the medieval fear of the supernatural at its most dynamic and aggressive. It wasn't just about spirits lingering in a graveyard. It was about a malevolent, organized force of the dead, actively storming through the world of the living. It was chaos, nature, and the wrath of the underworld all rolled into one. On All Hallows' Eve, when any soul could cross the veil, the fear that the wild hunt would choose this night to ride was a powerful and paralyzing thought. It was a reminder that some things in the dark were not just looking for a prayer or a soul cake. They were hunting.
For the devout and often terrified medieval Christian, the ultimate horror was not death itself. Death was an inevitable transition, a doorway that every soul had to pass through. The true terror lay in what came after death. Specifically, it was the fear of dying in a state of grace, but still imperfectly purified, and thus being condemned to the cleansing, agonizing fires of purgatory. This theological concept, which gained immense power in the Middle Ages, transformed Halloween from a night of fearing external monsters into a night of fearing for the fate of your own loved ones, and ultimately for your own soul. The doctrine of purgatory, formally defined by the Church in the 13th century, but popular for centuries before, posited an intermediate state after death. It was not hell, which was eternal damnation, nor was it heaven. Purgatory was a place or process of temporary punishment and purification, where the souls of those destined for heaven were cleansed of the temporal consequences of their sins. Medieval preachers and artists depicted it in vivid, terrifying detail. The punishments were often described as consisting of literal, material fire, more painful than any suffering on earth. This belief created a profound and unbreakable bond between the living and the dead. A soul in purgatory was suffering immensely and was powerless to shorten its own sentence. However, the living could intervene. Through prayers, almsgiving, and most powerfully, the celebration of Mass, the faithful on earth could earn merit that would be applied to the souls in purgatory, lessening their torment and hastening their entry into heaven. This is why All Souls' Day, on November 2nd, became such a crucial observance. It was the one day of the year dedicated entirely to this sacred duty. On All Hallows' Eve, the night before the great feasts for the saints and the souls, this anxiety reached its peak. The belief that the veil between worlds was thin now had a terrifying new implication. The spirits returning were not just ancient pagan entities, they were the souls of your own family members, temporarily released from their fiery prison to visit their former homes. They came seeking not vengeance, but help. A ghostly sigh in the night could be your mother, pleading for more prayers.
A sudden chill in the room could be your father reminding you of your duty. This gave rise to an intense spiritual and psychological pressure. To forget the dead, to fail to pray for them, was a profound act of betrayal. It meant leaving your loved ones to suffer. It also came with a superstitious fear of retribution. A neglected soul might become a haunting presence, its restlessness a direct result of your spiritual laziness. The popular folklore of the time was filled with stories of ghosts appearing to the living to ask for prayers, or to reveal the location of ill-gotten gains that needed to be returned before their soul could find peace. Therefore, the fear on Halloween was twofold. There was the external fear of demons, witches, and malevolent fairies, but there was also this deep, internal, and personal fear. It was the fear of failing your family, of being haunted not by a monster, but by the sorrowful spirit of someone you once loved. It was the fear that the afterlife was a place of bureaucratic suffering, where time was measured in pain and could only be shortened by the actions of others. Death was not the end. It was the beginning of a long and arduous process. And on Halloween, more than any other night, the medieval person felt the weight of their responsibility to the dead, and the chilling possibility that they might not be doing enough. This was, in many ways, a fear worse than death itself, the fear of a loved one's eternal suffering for which you might be partly to blame.
In a world teeming with invisible threats, from disgruntled ghosts to demonic armies, the medieval person yearned for tangible forms of protection. While prayer and faith were the bedrock of their spiritual defense, the medieval church offered something more concrete, the holy power of relics. On All Hallows' Eve, as fear of the supernatural reached its annual zenith, the belief in the protective and intercessory power of the saints, embodied in their physical remains, became a vital source of comfort and security. The cult of saints was a cornerstone of medieval Christianity. Saints were the superheroes of their day, men and women whose exemplary lives, and often brutal martyrdoms, had earned them a special place in heaven. From this privileged position, they were believed to be able to petition God directly on behalf of the living. Their relics, fragments of their bones, hair, clothing, or any object they had touched, were not just memorials. They were seen as conduits of divine power, capable of healing the sick, protecting against evil, and working miracles. Churches and cathedrals vied to possess the most powerful relics, which would draw pilgrims from hundreds of miles away. The feast of All Saints' Day on November 1st was the ultimate celebration of this heavenly host. It was a day to honor every single saint, from the most famous apostles to the countless anonymous holy men and women who had lived and died in faith. The Church taught that this communion of saints bound together the faithful in heaven, the suffering souls in purgatory, and the living on earth in one mystical body. On All Hallows' Eve, as people prepared for this great feast, they would have been acutely aware of this spiritual connection. They would pray to their patron saints, or to saints known for offering protection against specific threats like witchcraft or the plague, asking for their intercession on this most dangerous of nights. Churches with significant relic collections would become epicenters of spiritual power,
A villager might make a special visit to the parish church to pray before the reliquary containing the finger bone of a local saint, believing its physical proximity offered a shield against the demonic forces roaming outside. The vigil of All Hallows' Eve was a time to contemplate the power of these heavenly allies, reinforcing the idea that the living were not alone in their fight against the darkness. The splendor of the All Saints' Day Mass, with its candles, incense, and golden vestments, was designed to be a foretaste of the heaven that the saints now inhabited, a powerful vision of order and light to contrast with the chaotic darkness of pagan superstition. However, this system also had a more transactional and, at times, troubling side. The Church's teachings on purgatory and the power of intercession created a vast spiritual economy. If prayers could shorten a soul's time in purgatory, then so could other pious acts. This led to the system of indulgences, where the Church could grant a remission of temporal punishment for sins in exchange for specific actions, which often included financial contributions. While the theology was complex, in popular practice it sometimes resembled a business of salvation. Wealthy individuals, deeply anxious about their fate after death, would leave vast sums of money in their wills to establish chantries. These were endowments to fund priests whose sole job was to say Mass for the benefactor's soul in perpetuity, a constant stream of prayer aimed at speeding them through purgatory. For the common person, who could not afford such a lavish spiritual insurance policy, the options were more modest: giving alms in the form of soul cakes, lighting a candle in the church, or perhaps saving for months to pay for a single Mass to be said for a deceased parent. On Halloween, this entire system was thrown in sharp relief. The night was a stark reminder of one's mortality and the spiritual dangers that lay in wait. The relics of the saints offered a powerful defense, a tangible link to the divine. But the fate of the souls in purgatory, and your own future fate, depended on active participation in this economy of salvation. The fear was not just of the supernatural, but of spiritual bankruptcy, of arriving in the next world without having done enough, prayed enough, or given enough to secure a swift passage to paradise.
Beyond the familiar specters of ghosts, witches, and fairies, the medieval world was populated by a host of other monstrous creatures, lurking in the dark forests, the deep waters, and the uncharted corners of the map. These beings, drawn from a rich tapestry of classical mythology, religious texts, and local folklore, were not confined to storybooks. For many, they were a real and present danger, and their presence was felt most acutely during the long, dark nights of autumn, culminating in the supernatural free-for-all of All Hallows' Eve. The forests that pressed in on medieval villages were not the managed woodlands we know today. They were vast, dark, and dangerous places, and it was easy to believe they concealed more than just wolves and bears. This was the natural habitat of the werewolf, a creature that embodied the terrifying idea that the boundary between man and beast was just as fragile as the one between the living and the dead. Tales of men who could transform into ravenous wolves either through a curse or a pact with the devil were common.
On a full moon or a spiritually charged night like Halloween, the fear of encountering such a beast would have kept people huddled close to their hearths. Medieval bestiaries, or books of beasts, were filled with descriptions of creatures both real and imagined, and each was typically given a moral or allegorical meaning. But that didn't make them any less frightening. There was the basilisk, the king of serpents, whose gaze, breath, or even voice could kill instantly. There was the manticore, a horrifying hybrid with the body of a lion, the head of a man filled with rows of sharp teeth, and the tail of a scorpion that could shoot venomous spines. Even the familiar unicorn, though later seen as a symbol of purity, was originally described as a fierce, wild beast that could be incredibly dangerous. While these creatures were often said to live in faraway lands like India or Africa, the medieval mind did not have a firm grasp of geography. Far away could feel unnervingly close. The water held its own terrors. Mermaids, far from being romantic figures, were often portrayed as capricious and malevolent, luring sailors to their deaths by drowning. Rivers and lakes were home to various hostile spirits, and the sea concealed monsters like the sawfish, a dragon-like beast with giant wings that could allegedly slice a ship in two with the serrated crest on its back. Even the home was not entirely safe. The fear of changelings was a domestic terror that preyed on the deepest anxieties of parents. It was believed that fairies or elves would steal a healthy human baby from its cradle and leave a sickly, grotesque fairy child in its place. This belief was often used to explain birth defects, developmental disabilities, or childhood illnesses that were otherwise incomprehensible. These creatures represented the chaos and danger of a world that was not yet fully understood or tamed. The wilderness was not a place for recreation, it was the realm of monsters. Sickness was not just a biological process, it could be the work of malevolent forces. The belief in these beings reinforced the worldview of the Church, which positioned itself as the sole bastion of order and safety against the demonic horrors that lurked just beyond the village walls. On All Hallows' Eve, as the veil thinned, it wasn't just human souls that were thought to cross over. The night belonged to all supernatural beings. The strange noise outside wasn't just the wind, it could be the shuffling feet of a headless man. The shadow moving at the edge of the firelight wasn't just a trick of the eye, it could be a demon come to steal your soul. The darkness was not empty. It was crowded with the entire menagerie of the medieval imagination, and every one of them was a reason to fear the night.
The fire in the hearth has burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the single room of the cottage. Outside, the wind howls, a mournful, hungry sound that seems to carry voices on it. Every creak of the wattle and daub walls, every rustle in the thatch overhead is magnified in the oppressive silence. You are huddled with your family, wrapped in scratchy wool blankets, your faces illuminated by the flickering demonic grin of the carved turnip in the window. The children are asleep,
perhaps dreaming of soul cakes, or perhaps having nightmares of the monsters you've warned them about. For the adults, there is no sleep. There is only waiting. This is the final watch, the longest hours of the longest night, the slow, agonizing crawl toward the safety of dawn. All the fears of the medieval world have converged on this one night. The air itself feels heavy, thick with the presence of the unseen. You think of the spirits of your ancestors, and you hope that the food you left on the table and the prayers you whispered are enough to bring them comfort and secure their blessing. You pray they are not wandering, cold and forgotten, and that they will not hold your failings against you. Then your thoughts turn to the other spirits, the vengeful, the lost, the malevolent. You pray the salt line at your door holds firm, that the cross you chalked on the lintel is a strong enough shield, and that the grotesque face on your turnip lantern is frightening enough to ward them off. You listen to the wind, and you hear the baying of hounds. Is it just the storm, or is it the wild hunt thundering across the sky? You pull your blanket tighter, shutting your eyes and reciting a prayer, hoping they do not see the faint light of your cottage, hoping they do not stop. You think of the tales the village elders tell, of people snatched from their beds or found frozen in the fields the morning after the hunt has passed. You think of the witches who are said to be gathering at some unholy place in the forest, casting their spells and cursing their neighbors. Is the sudden pain in your joints just the cold, or is it the beginning of a dark charm? The greatest fear, though, is the one that lies within. It is the fear for the souls of your loved ones in purgatory. As the church bells toll through the night, a comforting, holy sound in the darkness, you are reminded of your duty. You murmur another prayer for your mother, for your grandfather, for the small child you lost to fever last winter. You picture them in the cleansing flames, and a profound sense of sorrow and responsibility washes over you. Have you done enough? Will your meager prayers be heard? The weight of their salvation feels heavy on your shoulders. Hours pass, measured only by the shifting shadows and the slow dying of the embers. Someone adds another log to the fire, the sudden flare of light a welcome, if temporary reprieve. You do not speak. Words feel dangerous tonight, as if they might attract unwanted attention. Instead, you sit in the shared, silent understanding of your family's fear. This is what it comes down to: a small circle of warmth and light in a vast, cold, and haunted darkness. And then, just when it feels as if the night will never end, you notice it. A faint gray line of light at the eastern horizon. It is almost imperceptible at first, but it is there. Dawn. The first light of November 1st, the Feast of All Saints. As the sky slowly brightens, a collective, unspoken sigh of relief fills the small cottage. The light pushes back the shadows. The wind seems to lose its menacing edge. The world, which felt so hostile and alien just an hour ago, begins to feel familiar again. You have survived. The veil is thickening. The portals to the other world are closing. The ghosts and ghouls are retreating to their realm, and the wild hunt has ridden on. The most dangerous night of the year is over. You made it. You rise on stiff, cold legs and open the door. The air is crisp and clean. You look toward the church, where the bells are now ringing, not with a sound of warning, but of celebration. It is All Saints' Day, a day of holy light, of hope, and of safety. And the relief you feel is more profound than any feast, more valuable than any treasure. It is the simple, beautiful, and overwhelming relief of having made it through the long, dark night. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, safe in a world that has largely forgotten these ancient terrors, spare a thought for those who spent this night huddled in the dark, armed with nothing but faith, folklore, and a flickering turnip. Their world was filled with monsters, their afterlife with fire, and their Halloween was a genuine confrontation with the deepest fears of the human heart. History is full of their quiet, desperate stories of survival. And as you close your eyes, be grateful for the light, for the silence, and for the simple fact that for you, the dawn is always guaranteed to come. Sleep well.